Under a staircase in a ruined Egyptian house, buried for nearly 1800 years, someone found a letter from a Roman soldier asking his father for warmer socks. The archaeologists who found it in 1924 recognized, carefully unfolding what looked like pressed wood, that the ink was still legible. A man named Claudius Terentianus, stationed somewhere on the edge of the Roman Empire in the early 2nd century, had written home. He wanted boots. He wanted news of his family. And buried in the letter, like a private confession, was the name of a woman he loved and was afraid to mention. He wasn't supposed to be a Roman legionary at all. The army had turned him away. Lack of the right references, the wrong connections, perhaps the wrong moment. And he had spent years in a lesser branch of the military, a lower status naval posting he tolerated while waiting for the door to finally open. When it did, he walked through it and found something very close to what you would find inside any institution built on shared hardship and absolute expectation. It was harder than he had imagined. And he did it anyway. Tonight, we are going to follow him. Not through the gleaming corridors of generals and emperors, through the mud and the morning drill, and the grain porridge eaten cold at dawn, through the ache of a march pack that weighed, when everything was loaded, close to 60 pounds. Through the silence of a barracks room he shared with 7 other men who smelled, by the end of a long day, like iron and effort and old sweat. The letters survive, and Claudius Terentianus, 2,000 years gone, still has things to say. Settle in. The ancient world smells like wood smoke and ground wheat and leather worn soft by years of use. It is safe to be here. Here is the thing that is easy to forget about the Roman Empire. For the people living inside it, it was simply the world. Egypt in the early 2nd century of the Common Era was the oldest civilized place in the known world. The pyramids at Giza were already older to Terentianus than the legions of Caesar are to us. The Nile still flooded in its ancient rhythm. The temples to gods whose names the Romans had barely learned to pronounce still caught the afternoon light and threw it back in gold and shadow. And yet Egypt in 100 AD was firmly, almost aggressively Roman. The road system, the legal system, the language of administration, Latin alongside Greek, papyrus full of bureaucratic forms, censuses, land surveys, tax records, markets full of olive oil and wine and garum, that savory, pungent fish sauce that Romans added to nearly everything the way we might reach for salt. Terentianus grew up in this world. His father, Claudius Tiberianus, was a Roman military veteran himself, a man who had served and settled in Coranis, a prosperous farming village in the Fayum region, about 60 miles southwest of Alexandria. The family was literate. His father kept books. Among the papyri found in the same house was a fragment of Thucydides, the great Greek historian of war. This was not a poor family, but it was a provincial one, and Terentianus grew up understanding 2 things simultaneously: that the Roman Empire was the world, and that the Roman legion was its beating heart. To be a legionary in the early 2nd century was to be something. Not a conscript. By the time of the emperors Trajan and Hadrian, the legion was a professional force of career soldiers who signed up voluntarily and committed to 25 years of service. You ate regularly. You had a salary, 300 denarii per year, a rate the Emperor Domitian had established a generation earlier by raising the traditional base wage. Yes, the army deducted money from your pay for food, equipment, and clothing, so your actual take-home might be closer to half that. But compared to the grinding precarity of civilian agricultural life, compared to the unpredictable wages of day labor in a city, a legionary's income was reliable. The state would feed you, equip you, and after your service was done, present you with a retirement payment of 3,000 denarii, roughly 10 years' wages, along with the possibility of a land grant in a newly settled province. The eagle standard of a Roman legion, the aquila, carried by the aquilifer, was sacred. Soldiers swore their oath before it. The loss of an eagle in battle was one of the greatest disgraces imaginable. Terentianus wanted this. From his letters we sense it clearly. A young man in a provincial town, watching soldiers pass on the road, feeling the pull of something larger than himself. He had his father's example. He had the empire all around him. The thing we most want always seems to be the thing we are told we cannot have. He would spend years finding out whether that was true. Here is a thing the history books rarely mention about the Roman legion. You couldn't always just walk in. By the early 2nd century, recruitment was not a simple matter of showing up at the gates. You needed to be a Roman citizen, or at least to prove you were. You needed to meet the physical standards, a minimum height of around 170 centimeters by many accounts, good eyesight, sound health. Recruiting officers, called conquisitores, examined candidates carefully. Even the condition of your teeth and gums could be grounds for rejection. The medical examination was thorough because the investment in training a legionary was enormous, and the army could not afford to waste it on someone who would break down within months. But perhaps most critically, and this is the detail that altered the entire course of Terentianus's life, you needed recommendations, references from people of standing, someone who could vouch for your character, your family, your reliability. If you were a provincial Egyptian, the son of a veteran settled far from the major military centers, navigating this web of connections was not straightforward. Terentianus tried. He wrote to his father asking for help, asking for introductions, asking for the social leverage that only Tiberianus, with his years of service and his network of veteran contacts, could provide. And for reasons the letters don't fully explain, perhaps the right connection wasn't available, perhaps the local legion had a surplus of recruits, he was turned down. The rejection must have stung. We don't have a letter describing the moment directly, but we can read it in what came next. Terentianus enlisted in the classis Alexandria, the fleet stationed at Alexandria, a lower-status naval force whose sailors were considered distinctly inferior to legionary soldiers in terms of prestige, pay, and prospects. His surviving letters from this period are full of requests, equipment he couldn't afford, clothing, money. In one letter, he mentions scrounging money from various acquaintances, getting a needle and linens from one person, but no cash, before pulling together enough to buy a few basic necessities. The resourcefulness is touching. The frustration underneath it is palpable. He was assigned to a ship called the Neptunus, part of the Alexandrian fleet, probably around 110 AD. He spent the next years serving, watching, waiting for the door to open again. What sustained him was the belief, correct as it turned out, that persistence paid off in the Roman military. Transfers happened. Openings appeared. A man with good service and a father who kept pressing the right people could, eventually, make his way through. And around 115 or 116 AD, historians believe, it happened. Claudius Terentianus was transferred into a Roman legion. The details are not entirely certain. Some scholars connect his transfer to the upheaval of the Jewish diaspora revolt of that period. Others see it as a more straightforward administrative progression. But by the time his letters from the legionary camp begin, the tone has shifted. He is somewhere with a tent, with 7 other men, with 60 pounds of gear waiting by the entrance, and a centurion who has not yet decided whether to like him. He had made it. But the years of waiting had not prepared him for what making it actually felt like. The door opens, and then you see what is on the other side. and you understand that the wanting was the easy part. Here is where most imaginations fail. When we picture a Roman soldier, we tend to picture the armor, the gleaming plates of the lorica segmentata, that iconic segmented torso armor with its overlapping iron strips and leather straps, the curved rectangular shield, the scutum, the helmet with its distinctive cheek guards and neck flange. It's impressive, visually arresting. But what no painting or sculpture can truly communicate is the weight. The lorica segmentata alone weighed around 8 to 9 kilograms. The helmet, another 2 to 3. The scutum, that great curved shield made of laminated wood covered in canvas and leather, bossed at the center with iron, was roughly 10 kilograms. The gladius, the short stabbing sword that was the legionary's primary weapon in close combat, added another kilogram or 2. Each soldier also carried 2 pila, heavy javelins of about 2 meters in length with long iron shanks designed to bend upon impact so they couldn't be thrown back. 2 of those, another 4 to 5 kilograms. And then the march pack. The sarcina, strapped to a forked pole called a furca and carried over the shoulder. It contained 3 days of rations, cooking equipment, entrenching tools, a pickaxe for digging the daily camp fortifications, wooden stakes for the defensive palisade, a mess kit, blankets, personal items. Add it all together and a Roman legionary on the march was carrying somewhere between 30 and 45 kilograms. On some modern estimates, accounting for all gear, closer to 50. Now put it on your back. Now march. Not stroll, not walk at your own pace. March. At the military pace, a Roman soldier was expected to cover 20 Roman miles, roughly 30 kilometers, in 5 summer hours. That is sustained movement. That is calves burning and lungs working and the iron strips of your armor shifting against the leather padding underneath with every step. The hobnailed sandals, the caligae, gripped the road with metal studs that wore through in weeks of hard campaigning. The straps of the pack ground into shoulders that were already carrying the combined weight of civilization. Terentianus did this. We know he did, because he survived. But imagine the first time. Imagine being a recruit from a provincial Egyptian town, even a physically capable one, even one who had spent years in the fleet, and being told this is what the next 25 years look like. Not every day, but regularly, measurably, as a demonstration of fitness and discipline that was itself part of the point. Because the Romans understood something that military training has never stopped understanding. The march was not just about getting somewhere, it was about proving that you could. Vegetius, the 4th century military writer whose Epitome Rei Militaris is our most complete surviving guide to Roman military practice, wrote plainly that sweat in training saved blood in war. Recruits trained with swords and shields twice the weight of the real ones. Morning drill, afternoon drill, weapon work, formation work, running, jumping over obstacles, swimming when water was available. After months of this, after seasons of it, a man stopped thinking about the weight. He simply moved. That is what the body learns when the mind finally runs out of objections. It finds a way forward. It stops asking whether it can, and simply does. That is what Terentianus was becoming. Not a soldier yet, in the fullest sense, but a body that had learned to stop arguing with itself. But a Roman legionary was never alone. Not once. Not for a single day of his service. The smallest unit in the Roman army was the contubernium, a word that translates loosely as tent party, though it meant something much deeper. 8 men assigned together, who shared everything for the duration of their service. A leather tent on campaign, a pair of connected barrack rooms in a permanent fort, a mule for carrying shared baggage. a cooking pot, a hand mill for grinding grain, and the accumulated weight of years of proximity. The word contubernalis, what they called each other, carried the sense of something more than colleagues, fellow tentmates, men who had seen each other sick, angry, afraid, and triumphant. Men whose snoring was familiar, whose habits you had memorized without trying. In a permanent fort, the contubernium occupied 2 rooms. The front room held weapons and equipment. The back room was for living and sleeping. 8 men in a space that was, by any reasonable measure, extremely small. Each barrack block held 10 of these pairs of rooms, end to end, with the centurions. Quarters at the far end, notably larger, notably quieter. The centurion himself was a constant presence. Not necessarily a physical giant, though some were, more precisely a force of will and expectation, carrying his vitus, a vine staff that was the mark of his authority, and his principal instrument of everyday discipline. Minor infractions brought immediate physical consequences, and the centurion's optio, his second in command, managed the paperwork and daily organization of the century's 80 men. The signifer, who carried the century's standard, also administered the unit's financial records and savings account. Even at this smallest level, the Roman army was bureaucratic in ways that feel almost contemporary. Rosters, duty schedules, written records of every assignment. On garrison duty, which was where Terentianus spent much of his service, the day organized itself in predictable rhythms. Dawn, wake, eat, prepare. Morning, training or assigned duties, guard shifts, patrol, maintenance work on the fort's walls and buildings, road repair, administrative tasks. Afternoon, more training in summer, lighter duties in the cold months. Evening, the communal meal, the shared fire, the dice games that were as universal in the Roman army as they are in any army in any era. Sleep, and then the whole thing again. The Vindolanda tablets, thin wooden writing slices found at a fort near Hadrian's Wall in northern England and dating to around 100 AD, give us a vivid companion to Terentianus's letters from almost exactly the same era. From Vindolanda, we learn that a junior officer once wrote to his superior to complain that the men had no beer, and please could some be sent. We find birthday party invitations, supply manifests listing pepper and oil and tallow, a request for warm socks and sandals from someone shivering on the northern frontier. The letters and the tablets together build a picture that no official history ever quite captures. The Roman soldier, far from home, doing something entirely ordinary, and very much hoping for a parcel. The most powerful armies in history have always been made of people waiting for letters from home. That was as true 2,000 years ago as it is today. Terentianus ate pulse for breakfast. Pulse was wheat porridge, farro or emmer wheat boiled down with water, sometimes flavored with salt, olive oil, garum, whatever the contubernium had available. His comrades had grinding stones in the barracks room. They milled their own grain each day because the army supplied wheat rather than flour, and the milling was part of the daily labor. The smell of grain ground on stone, mixed with the smell of wood smoke from the small hearth, would have been the smell of every morning for 25 years. Bread was the other staple, flatbread baked on the hearthstones or in the large dome-shaped ovens that permanent forts maintained. Each barrack block had access to communal baking facilities, and centuries took turns. The bread came out dense and solid, the kind that sat in the stomach through hours of morning drill without complaint. On campaign, the portable version was bucculatum, hard biscuit, twice baked to remove moisture, practically indestructible, carried in the march pack because it wouldn't spoil. Ancient sources are frank about the fact that it was not pleasant to eat. It was fuel, which was the point. Pork appeared in various forms: smoked bacon, salt pork, dried sausage carried in the pack for quick eating on the march. Legumes, lentils, beans, chickpeas, provided protein and variety. Cheese, usually made from sheep's or goat's milk, aged enough to survive transport. Dried figs, apples when available, foraged greens when the army was moving through country that offered them. The drink of the common soldier was posca, vinegar diluted with water and sometimes herbs. It sounds unappetizing. It was in fact practical. The acidity killed bacteria in questionable water. The mixture hydrated efficiently, and it kept better in leather pouches than plain water in warm climates. Wine was also available, though nothing like what the officers drank. Beer appeared at frontier postings where local tradition favored it. The soldier from Vindolanda asking his superior for beer was not expressing an unusual preference. He simply wanted what the country around him produced. All of it was deducted from pay. The signifer kept the accounts and settled them at each payment. A legionary who drew his wages 3 times a year would find, when the accounting was done, that perhaps half had already gone. Food, clothing deductions, equipment maintenance, contributions to the burial fund that ensured his comrades could afford a proper funeral if he died in service. What remained was his own. He could spend it on extra food at the traders' stalls that always clustered outside fort walls, on dice, on a drink at the inn, on a gift sent home in a letter that might take weeks to arrive. Claudius Terentianus, in one of his surviving papyri, writes to ask his father's blessing to bring a woman into his household, a woman whose name we don't know, who was likely Egyptian, whom he had met near his posting. He wanted to live with her. He was asking permission, carefully, deferentially, as a man in his 30s still navigating the social architecture of his family. We don't know what his father said. The woman remains a mystery, like so many people in the ancient world, present for a moment in the edge of someone else's story, then gone. But that Terentianus took the time, in the middle of military service, to write about her at all, to place her in his future, says something important. He was not only a soldier, he was a person, carrying his own private interior world through all of it. His life did not belong entirely to Rome. Part of it was still his own. Somewhere around 115 or 116 AD in Alexandria, one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the ancient world, the streets caught fire. The city had always been combustible in more than one sense. Greek, Jewish, and Egyptian communities existed in close, often contentious proximity. Under the surface of Roman administration, old tensions ran deep. When the diaspora revolt broke out, Jewish communities across Egypt, Cyprus, and Cyrene rising against Roman authority in a conflict that was brutal on all sides, Alexandria became a place of violent street-level chaos. Terentianus was there. He tells us so himself in a fragmentary surviving letter known to scholars as P. Michigan 5400, which describes a riot. The letter is damaged. Much of the upper portion is lost, but what remains is unmistakable. He was in the streets of Alexandria when the violence was at its height. He was wounded. We don't know where he was hit or how serious the injury was, because the relevant portion of the papyrus has deteriorated beyond reading. It is reasonable to infer, given that he continued his service for another 2 decades, that he recovered fully or very nearly so. But the moment itself was real. What cared for him in that recovery is something that surprises nearly everyone who encounters it for the first time. Here is the thing about the Roman army that cuts against every image of pure brutality. It built the closest thing the ancient world ever produced to a professional medical corps. Each legion maintained a hospital, the valetudinarium, built into the fort's layout in a standardized rectangular form with 4 wings arranged around a central courtyard, an entrance hall that served as a triage area, an operating theater, a dispensary, a kitchen, staff quarters, and facilities for washing and sanitation. The chief medical officer, the optio valetudinari, reported directly to the camp prefect. Below him served surgeons skilled in treating battlefield wounds and medici ordinari, regular secund, soldiers trained in wound care and general illness. On the battlefield itself, and in street violence like what Terentianus encountered, the first responders were the capsari, trained bandagers who moved through the chaos applying pressure to wounds, binding injuries with linen soaked in vinegar, and getting the injured onto stretchers or into wagons for transport to care. Roman surgeons used instruments that archaeologists have recovered in remarkable numbers: scalpels with replaceable blades, bone drills, specialized spoon-shaped tools designed to extract embedded arrowheads without enlarging the wound. They used what we now understand to be genuinely effective anesthetic compounds, preparations from the opium poppy, from henbane seeds, which contain scopolamine, a compound still used in medicine today, from white mandrake root. The surgery was painful by any measure, but the pain was, to some extent, managed. The institution that trained men to march until they stopped, thinking about the weight, also trained other men to carry them back when they fell. The same army that could execute you for cowardice built hospitals to heal your wounds. Brutal and careful, merciless and methodical, both at once. Terentianus recovered. He continued to serve. His later letters place him in Syria, likely in connection with the Emperor Trajan's Parthian campaigns, the Great Eastern Push that briefly extended Roman territory toward the Persian Gulf before Trajan's death and Hadrian's strategic consolidation. He is present in the documentary record through these years, a man somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, marching and building and occasionally bleeding and writing letters home that took weeks to arrive. The wound in Alexandria is the closest the letters come to the specific texture of what it cost him physically. He doesn't describe it in detail. Roman soldiers didn't tend to. There was a culture in the legions that regarded the body's damage as a private thing, something to be endured rather than performed. You were injured, you were treated, you returned to service. He expected this of himself. His 7 tentmates expected it of him, and that expectation, it turns out, was its own form of care. There is something you need to understand about Roman military discipline before you can fully grasp what it would have felt like to be Terentianus, because here is the real tension at the heart of his story. The army he spent years desperate to join was also capable of killing him for losing his nerve in a single critical moment. That is the contradiction he lived inside. Not the weight of the pack, not the porridge at dawn, the knowledge that the institution he had chosen was entirely capable of destroying him if he failed it. Every legionary swore an oath, the sacramentum, upon enlistment. In the early empire, this oath was sworn to the emperor personally, a bond understood as sacred, as absolute. You were not simply an employee of the Roman state. You were a sworn man, with all the weight that implied in a world that took oaths seriously. The oaths were enforced by a system of punishments that ranged from the mundane to the severe. Your pay could be docked for lost equipment. You could be assigned the worst duties, the latrines, the most exhausting labor details, extra night watches, for minor failures. You could be demoted, stripped of rank, transferred to a lesser unit. For serious offenses, you could be flogged. For desertion or dereliction in a combat situation, you could be executed by your own comrades in a process called fustuarium, beaten to death with clubs, a punishment designed to make the entire unit complicit in eliminating the man who had endangered them. decimation, the famous punishment in which every 10th man of a disgraced unit was executed by the other 9, was real, though scholars now understand it was far rarer than popular history suggests. Appian records a documented case in 71 BC when the general Crassus decimated troops during the final campaign against Spartacus. It appears perhaps a handful of times across the full span of Roman military history, always in cases of mutiny or catastrophic battlefield cowardice. More recent scholarship has raised the possibility that by the imperial period, it functioned partly as a rhetorical threat, a power held in reserve, seldom spent, so that its existence could do its work without requiring the reality. But its rarity did not make it theoretical. It simply meant the threat did not need to be carried out very often to be believed. This was not merely cruelty, it was a form of social architecture. The contubernium system, 8 men living together, eating together, training together, being rewarded and punished together, created something that every military institution since has tried to recreate. The irreplaceable bond that makes men willing to stand in a line when every instinct says, run. The bond that comes not from ideology or nationalism, but from the simple, powerful fact of knowing the men beside you, of having ground grain alongside them at dawn, of having listened to their breathing in the dark, of knowing that if you ran, you would survive your fear and live with their eyes on you for the rest of your days. The most powerful chain in any institution is not the one that restrains. It is the one that connects. The Romans understood this so completely that they built it into the smallest possible unit, 8 men, 1 tent, and trusted it to hold an empire. When you read the translated letters of Claudius Terentianus, and they are accessible, you can find them. What strikes you first is not the exoticism. What strikes you is the familiarity. A man asking for money, a man asking for news of his family, a man complaining about the cold and the poor quality of his equipment, a man trying to explain why he hasn't written in so long, a man describing a violent day in a city street with the controlled understatement of someone who has learned that some things don't need to be said in full. A man writing to a father who is old and far away and probably worried. 2,000 years. An empire built on stone and iron and the particular determination of men who chose, against considerable odds, to make it their life's work. Terentianus was discharged in 136 AD. We know this from a document found among the same papyri that explicitly records his release in the 21st year of the Emperor Hadrian's reign. He had done it. The provincial Egyptian turned away for lack of references, who spent years in the fleet before finally getting his chance, who was wounded in a city street and kept going, who wrote letters home asking for boots and permission and news of home. He had completed the full term, 25 years, his oath fulfilled. What did he do then? Here the record grows uncertain, which is where history becomes mystery, and mystery becomes the thing that stays with us. Based on what we know of veterans in the Roman world, it is likely he returned to Coranis, his father's house, the village where the papyri were found. Perhaps he settled there with the woman he had written about, the one whose name we never learn. Perhaps he became like his father before him, a veteran in a village, a man with a story and a quiet life, and a house with stairs. The letters remained, folded under those stairs, for century after century, until archaeologists from the University of Michigan lifted them into the light in 1924. They are now preserved in the University of Michigan Papyrology Collection in Ann Arbor, a climate-controlled archive where the careful handwriting of Claudius Terentianus remains legible to anyone who wishes to look. If you were dropped into the camp on the morning of his first full day as a legionary, the answer to tonight's question would be honest. you would be overwhelmed. Not immediately killed. You are not in immediate combat. You are in the training yard, and the centurion is showing you the drill, and the man next to you is from a village 300 miles away, and the wooden practice sword in your hand weighs twice what you expected, and breakfast was porridge that tasted of nothing in particular. You would not last the week of training. You would not manage the monthly route march in full kit. You would not sleep well on a straw mat in a room of 8 men with the guard horn sounding through the night. You would not thrive on posca and hard biscuit and the centurion's considered opinion of your shield work. But Terentianus did. Year after year, posting after posting, riot and wound and recovery, and the long ordinary stretches in between. He did. He was a free man at the end. His oath fulfilled, his letters written. Not the life of a general, not a life anyone would carve into marble. A life of daily work, done fully and without retreating from it. The letters are in Ann Arbor. Claudius Terentianus, who wanted desperately to belong to the most formidable military institution in the ancient world, and ultimately did, who asked his father for boots and permission and money and news of home, survives on papyrus 2,000 years after the empire that shaped him crumbled into memory. Not forgotten, not voiceless. He asked for a parcel from home, and we are still reading his words. The small things endure. The letters outlast the empire. This has always been true, and it is still true now. Before you drift all the way into sleep tonight, if this episode brought the ancient world a little closer, please consider leaving a like or subscribing to Sleepable History. It helps this channel reach more people who want to close their eyes and visit places that no longer exist. We will be back soon with another story. The papyrus is still there, under the light. The ink is faded but legible. The staircase it was hidden under is gone. The house, the village, the civilization, all dust and memory. But the letter remains. A son writing to a father. A soldier writing home. The handwriting careful, because he wanted his father to be able to read it clearly, all those miles and weeks away. The camp is quiet now. The fires are banked. The night watch makes its slow rounds. And somewhere in the dark behind the barracks, 8 men breathe in the rhythm that 8 men who have lived together long enough finally find, nearly synchronized, nearly one, as close to peace as the Roman frontier ever got. Rest now.